Now, last week, I did a pretty intense episode on trauma bonding, and I got some really interesting feedback, especially since the episode wasn't really on conventional definitions of trauma bonding. I did use it as a metaphor, which can be debatable in its application. Ongoing discussion. Happy to hear more comments and more questions with regards to this. But as promised, well, actually, on second thought, come to think of it, I didn't promise, but I did make a mention to another article I'd written on intermittent reinforcement from an artistic perspective, or an artist's perspective, to be more precise. And I had some inquiries regarding this as well. What's in intermittent reinforcement? Now, I realize a lot of the terms I used in these podcasts can sound a little foreign, a little, I don't know, nerdy, a little, or even intimidating. So my primary objective in doing these podcasts is to educate, if that doesn't sound too high-handed, but also we'll discuss and elaborate on what these concepts are. I'm not trying to make psychologists out of anyone here, but I do want to do my little bit to kind of unpack these concepts and see if we can't use them in our work to our advantage. Today's recording is a direct Zoom recording, which is open to audiences. Some people from the community who might be checking in on the Zoom call. So I'm not quite sure how audio is going to turn out. I'm experimenting quite a few new techniques with the whole solo cast thing, mostly because I want to make these things as accessible as I can to my community. And there's a whole lot going on the back end at the Holistic Musician Academy, which I will get into later on. I want to tell you about too. But just FYI, in case the audio sounds a little different than you're used to today, I do ask for a little leeway. Let's get into it. Some experiences echo deeply. You don't notice how they tend to reshape your mindset, your nervous system, until much later. You show up in a relationship. Some days there's tenderness, some days there's connection, and a sense of certainty that you're being seen and you know exactly the space you're in. Then there are other days, sometimes in the very same relationship, be it with a collaborator or a mentor, where you sense absence, maybe on your own part or from the person you're engaging with. You sense some distance, maybe a shift in the warmth. Not necessarily a big confrontation as such, but not a clear goodbye, sometimes a little silence. And then again, the presence of affection, up until the point where you start feeling uncomfortable. Now, maybe it's just a bad day, but sometimes if the inconsistency, that brand of inconsistency, becomes consistent in some of the people we hang out with, then it's something to unpack. And this is the kind of inconsistency that can quietly rewire us to start normalizing instability. And that is what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, which is kind of like a reward schedule where the feedback you get from whoever it is you're engaging with, assuming it's the same person, is inconsistent. Not just inconsistent, unpredictable. And eventually in all the wrong ways, especially powerful in shaping behavior. And while it's most commonly discussed ironically, like this concept of intermittent reinforcement, in the context of gambling and, again, abusive relationships, man, my grammar is really off today, my apologies, it's silently underpins a great deal of how creatives tend to learn to relate to their creative ecosystems. If you go back and listen to last week's episode on trauma bonding, there are a lot of common links between that and what we're talking about today. Here's the thing about our nervous system, or mindset, or perspective, lens on life, whichever way you want to term it. I prefer the nervous system because it seems to be the most encompassing, all-encompassing. One of the hardest things about something like intermittent reinforcement, I'm going to keep using that term so you get used to it, is that it doesn't register through logic. It happens in the subconscious mind, again, in the nervous system, in your body maybe, in certain sense of tension, you kind of end up registering, saving. Sometimes it's registered in attachment patterns, which for layman terminology is the manner in which we kind of tend to attach ourselves to a certain relationship or associate ourselves with a certain relationship. But all of this can embed itself in our memory, in our physical memory, in our mental memory, in our emotional memory, that entire feeling of what it feels like to be noticed and or neglected. Now, experts, people who often go by the name like attachment theorists, it's a thing, by the way, have long shown how inconsistent caregiving often leads to anxious, preoccupied, or disorganized relationships or attachment styles. That's actually academically verified stuff. Again, if you go to the blog post, you'll see references where you can look it up for all you hardcore nerds there. These patterns, especially if early, will tend to shape how we regulate uncertainty later on in life, including how we tolerate inconsistency in creative and professional spaces. So in short, if the love you received at earlier phases of your life, as a kid or during your earlier music lessons or even in college or any formative part of your life, significant formative part of your life, your nervous system might have learned to equate inconsistency with connection or even intimacy. So unpredictability becomes a kind of normal baseline. So when you're praised one day, ignore the next. When a collaborator disappears, when a mentor disappears and then returns out of the blue just when you thought they were out of your life, your system isn't seeing the danger. In fact, it might even mistake something like that as possibility. When that becomes a lifestyle, something you're kind of like really integrating in your workflow, it tends to spill over in multiple capacities. And over time, this kind of emotional conditioning doesn't just stay in relationships. It risks showing up in how we build our lives. We learn to stay in rooms where the rules are always shifting. We kind of subconsciously almost expect people to disappear, to confuse temporary validation with care. And a lot of times in professional circles, our adaptability is collapsed with professionalism, when in reality, what it really is a defense mechanism or survival tactic. This is where intermittent reinforcement becomes a lifestyle and where it starts to bleed into our creative practice, industry relationships, and workspace behavior. Now, why are we talking about this? this isn't a psychology lesson, right? There is a very specific reason. I try to introduce these concepts to my collaborators, students, mentees, or generally people I hang out with. The artist's career as a general intermittent reward loop is a legit concept. Because the parallels to artistic life, creative life, are not just poetic, they're kind of systemic. Now hear me out here. The music industry, or the arts industry, or any kind of creator industry, if you're a speaker or a coach or, I don't know, quote-unquote influencer, not my favorite terminology, but, something on those lines. If your profession revolves around creativity, a lot of the industry will rely on what could be termed as intermittent reward structures to manage the creator behavior. Some examples of these can be occasional and random praise from industry players, important figures, gatekeepers, with long silences in between. You send a demo to a record label, hear nothing, and then all of a sudden you have an email in your inbox. Or you reach out to a collaborator who could be someone who could assist you in a certain project you're trying to work on. And you're not really sure if they're going to respond. One day they do, the next they don't. You're not really sure where you stand. Public visibility offered in unpredictable, often opaque ways. You're not really sure how much visibility you'll get with your work. Did that PR campaign work out? Did that magazine agree to do an article on your latest work? Is your PR company, is your agent doing what they're supposed to? You never really know. Yeah. Resources like playlist ads, grants, syncs, all of these are distributed quite inconsistently, and hence ends up fostering a culture of hope chasing, if that's a thing. Unfortunately, it is a thing. I'm not sure that term actually exists, but most of us do spend a large chunk of our time and energy chasing what could be cynically referred to as hope. Some stuff to unpack there as well, but let's not go there just yet. Either way, in this sense, the system begins to mimic the same schedule of reinforcement that drives something like gambling addiction. By the way, this is a statement from the American Psychiatric Association in 2013, who say that a system like this does tend to apparently mimic a schedule similar to the schedule of reinforcement that drives addictions like gambling. That unpredictable nature of feedback makes it especially potent and particularly dangerous for people whose work is tied to identity and emotion. If none of this, all the terminology, all the nerdy stuff, resonated with you, that last line though, I will bet, did. That unpredictable nature of feedback you get on your work, on your identity, makes it especially potent and particularly dangerous for us folks whose work is tied intimately to our identity and emotional landscape. Let's go through a few examples to deepen how this can be the case. Yeah, rehearsal rooms. Shall we do Whiplash as a case study? Because it's not just an abstract pattern we're talking about here in the industry. It really is alive and well in institutions, rehearsal rooms. Whiplash, by the way, I've never actually managed to watch through the entire thing. It's way too triggering for me. But Whiplash, for example, the famous movie, is a pretty brutal portrait of why did I say portrait twice? I'm not sure. Anyway, either way, a pretty brutal depiction of a band leader who alternates cruelty with praise, humiliation with moments of connection. So the conductor's approval is erratic, his cruelty is justified as quote-unquote motivation, and what makes the dynamic so painful eventually isn't just the yelling, which, by the way, is like pretty crappy, but it's not that which actually makes it as painful as we think it is. It's the rare, unpredictable moments of recognition and the constant feeling of not knowing exactly how the response is going to be to what you're offering. And this dynamic is far from fictional. Many musicians will recognize the rehearsal room where one person holds the emotional power of the group, where kindness is rationed and criticism floods the space. But occasionally the band leader smiles, nods, approves, and in that moment, every other moment is sold to be something worth it. That's not art history. That's just shitty conditioning. And when we've internalized that brand of inconsistency as part of being a serious artist, serious about our work, we tend to stop questioning it at some point and learn to crave that nod instead, without actually unpacking the harm that might be taking place in this entire habit or pattern. Some even eventually end up calling it greatness instead of what it actually is, which is intermittent reinforcement of validation, of motivation, of positivity, of helpful feedback. And all of this dysfunctional pattern often disguised as leadership. That's the rehearsal room, but there's more for us folks. There are the algorithms, the dopamine spikes that comes with, and the new gatekeepers. Yeah, in the digital age, this whole pattern's gone next level. The whole algo circus on platforms, Spotify, Instagram, TikTok. I mean, Spotify is like a whole different league of a shit show at this moment. I'm not really sure where that's headed, so I'm kind of keeping quiet on that whole front for the time being. But even social media, regular social media like Instagram, TikTok, offer just about enough visibility, just about enough engagement, just about enough reward to keep most of us producing work. But the metrics are never consistent. The feedback you get, the loop is erratic, and the rewards rarely correlate directly with the quality or the depth of our work. Now, neuroscientific studies show that dopamine release is stronger when rewards are unpredictable. Think about that one. Dopamine release is stronger when the rewards are unpredictable than when they're guaranteed. Again, verified research. So, what this unpredictability is doing is basically fostering compulsive behavior, encouraging it, and what's sometimes referred to as a dopamine treadmill. Dark scenario there, dopamine treadmill. Dang, I'm not even a huge fan of treadmills in general. Either way, artists are particularly vulnerable because the work isn't separate from the self. When our work is an extension of our emotional landscape, the inner architecture, the stakes of something like intermittent reinforcement, inconsistent feedback, aren't just professional. They end up being personal, somatic, spiritual even for some of us. Yeah. If our work is not just service provision, it's something we're invested in on all levels from a deep space. The effects of something like this unpredictability is really deep. So what exactly does it cost? Well, for one, the first thing I want to point out is the costs that we are dealing with are quiet and cumulative. So it's not something you notice right away, which is why it's as dangerous as it is. Some of the collateral damage can be you begin to mistrust your instincts. You start second-guessing yourself. You start shaping your work around quote-unquote imagined expectations. You stay in projects that no longer nourish you because something might still become of them, or so you think. And at some point, you might start internalizing the whole inconsistency as something you need to fix without actually recognizing that maybe there's nothing to fix in the first place because it's not fixable. Maybe that entire situation is something that's inherently dysfunctional and not something you need to be a part of or want to be a part of. Bessel van der Kolk, a trauma researcher, once said, being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. But creatives all too often, not just creatives, but creatives all the more, are kind of trained to feel safe in unsafe rhythms. Because we've been taught that discomfort is what makes it real. And the reason why this problem is as real as it is there is some truth to that. Working in creative spaces has a lot to do with getting out of our comfort zone. But there is a line which, when crossed, goes into an entirely different territory, which doesn't really have a lot to do with the rewards of pushing ourselves beyond our regular lazy comfort zone. Yeah, so there are different kind of comfort zones. There's the one which is just a result of laziness. Then there's the not so good crossing over out of the comfort zone, which is where we're basically pushing ourselves beyond our capacity, or more importantly, in spaces which are not in alignment to our true inner vision. That is not a good quote-unquote discomfort zone. Yeah. I apologize if I butchered that entire metaphor, but hopefully you got the gist of what I was trying to get at. So what's the solution here? Repatterning. So you kind of rewiring that entire pattern. A return to rhythm over reward. A return to an authentic process over the results. Recovery from intermittent reinforcement isn't a productivity strategy, though. It's more like a nervous system repair. It's about reclamation, reclaiming our inner rhythm. It's about remembering that our work can be in dialogue with our external surroundings without being chained to it. And here's where it starts, with reliable internal structures. Yeah. So figuring out a way to kind of anchor yourself in your inner values, in your inner process, your intentionality. You know me, I'm always going on about the why behind what we do. That's the first step. Then there are the relationships that are involved in collaboration in our ecosystem. And you want to make sure that these relationships are not based on excitement, not just opportunity, but also consistency, emotional consistency, professional consistency, maybe even financial consistency, depending on what the context is. And making sure that these are relationships that have a future. It's not that different from dating, to be honest, which, by the way, is another classic scenario for intermittent reinforcement to make its presence felt. Relationships do have a lot of parallels, regardless of which capacity we're dealing with them. But not to go off on too much of a tangent there. The role of silence is a big one. A lot of times we tend to spiral a little when the absence of response is the reality we're dealing with. But here's a little truth bomb for you. The absence of a response is not the absence of worth. Let me say that again. That was pretty cool. The absence of response, well, external response, not our inner ones, is not the absence of worth. Someone or something or some group not responding to your work in the way you expected, or not responding in any way, has actually nothing to do with the true value of what your work brings with it, and certainly not the true value of you as a human being. To be clear, that's not a license to be lazy about the way we go about our work, but just rewind and listen back to what I said. Again, the absence of response is not the absence of work. Alertness is another point I want to point you to. There's a difference between support and access. Some parties will just want proximity to our potential, and that's not safety. It doesn't mean they're malicious per se, but it is important that there is a certain degree of clarity in our engagement with people, our collaborators, or even the ecosystem we're engaging in. That the proximity involved, the closeness, the intimacy, is not because your potential is being tested. You deserve more. We deserve more as creators. And last but not the least, even though this might sound a little repetitive, it's imperative that we anchor our creative practice, not just the process, but our entire practice. Between process and practice is the difference that the practice is a little broader. It's not just the internal process, but it also involves our professional commitments, stuff like PR, logistics, the works. So our entire professional practice, our career, all of that is rooted in inner values, not variables. Our general compass should not be rooted in variables. Variables will come, and we want to stay rooted in our values, so when they do come, we have a better sense of orientation. Spotify's mood board or the latest algorithm on TikTok should not shape your voice. Neither should someone else's silence. Now, that doesn't mean you completely bypass the role these things play in your professional life, but what I'm saying is don't start there. Those are really not the primary intentionality you want to be focusing on. Definitely not. So keep reminding yourself why you're doing what you do, and use that as a lens to navigate the rest of it. Final thoughts. Now, intermittent reinforcement kind of teaches us to stay close to what's inconsistent. And even as I say that out loud, that's pretty messed up. Yeah, basically hoping for scraps, making ourselves small. Confucius says, no, Confucius doesn't say anything. TL says that to confuse tension with truth or depth or mystery or mystique. No, not always. Our work and our mental health, our nervous system deserves better than constant guesswork. Yeah, it deserves some degree of stability, safety, rhythm. The whole mystical, romantic artist lifestyle and the craziness of it all might seem romantic on the surface, but for those of us who have been doing this for a while and have been doing it because we want to sustain our career, we know that our inner world needs to have safety and rhythm and stability. So we deserve relationships, professional and personal, that reflect our commitment, our fulfillment, and not our hunger or not our neediness. Think about that one. Because art, no matter how you're practicing it, at its best, doesn't really come from guessing what the world wants. Now, business gurus will tell you otherwise. They'll ask you to explore a market gap or do market research. And I'm not going to dismiss that, but at the core of our work, the core of our art needs to be rooted in something a lot higher and deeper, at the risk of sounding a little pompous. It has to do a little more with identity, from remembering who we are and why we are here. Hope that helps.